A quick disclaimer to the involved parties. This is not legal advice. I am not your lawyer, and I definitely, absolutely do not want to be. All rise. The Court of Public Opinion is now in session. The Honorable Judge Mooney is presiding. Please be seated. On the plaintiff's side, we have Karl Jobst, some ordinary gamers, and the public, and on the defendant's side we have Gerard the Completionist Khalil, and the 501c3 charity organization, the Open Hand Foundation. The background, in short, is as follows. Gerard the Completionist Khalil is a successful YouTuber. He runs an annual fundraising event called Indieland, which raises money for the Open Hand Foundation, a charitable organization founded by his father in memory of his mother, who sadly passed from frontal-temporal dementia in 2003. Gerard often talks about the good that the Open Hand Foundation does, including the distribution of its raised funds to organizations such as the Alzheimer's Association. On November 13, 2023, YouTubers Karl Jobst and some ordinary gamers released a cooperative expose on the Open Hand Foundation revealing that the organization, as per its publicly available Form 990-PF tax returns, hadn't actually distributed any money. And since then, we've seen a back and forth between the plaintiffs and the defendants that continues to this very day, each levying allegations at the other. It seems like everyone on YouTube has already weighed in on the situation, offering their hot takes fresh from the peanut gallery. Well, we are going to do something different. We are going to approach this situation like a lawyer does, and break down each allegation levied by the plaintiffs, weigh it against the evidence, and present our findings. In so doing, we'll break down what 501c3 organizations are, what their legal and ethical obligations are, and see which, if any, of the plaintiffs' accusations are legitimate, and which perhaps might be less so. But first, you know it takes a sharp mind to do good lawyering, and if you'd like to hone your intellect, then Moon Channel's returning sponsor Brilliant is exactly what you are looking for. Brilliant proves that learning can be fun with its thousands of interactive lessons ranging from basics to advanced topics. You can learn math, data science, computer science, and more in an interactive, tactile way. If you're a busy professional like I am and can barely find time to even sleep, Brilliant is built for you. It's fun and low pressure while also being effective and efficient. Brilliant's bite-sized lessons teach you helpful skills but feel like fun games. And with new content being released monthly, there's always something new for you to learn. Try Brilliant free for a full 30 days by clicking on the link provided in the description of the video or by visiting brilliant.org/moonchannel. If you're one of the first 200 people to sign up, you'll even get 20% off an annual subscription. So why wait? Give Brilliant a try today. That's brilliant.org/moonchannel. Why settle for smart when you could be brilliant? A warning before we continue, the following section involves a lawyer breaking down the tax code for like 10 minutes straight. If, like a sane person, that sounds horrible to you, please skip ahead to the next chapter of the video. I promise it'll be interesting though if you stay to watch. Before we get into our breakdown of the allegations, it is important to do the lawyerly thing and define our terms, to set the stage, if you will. Let's start with the obvious. The Open Hand Foundation is a 501c3 organization. What does that mean, and what obligations does a 501c3 have? Well, to start, the name 501c3 comes from, as one might expect, the United States Internal Revenue Code, Section 501c3. Now, the Internal Revenue Code is labyrinthine, to put it mildly. It's about 5,000 pages long as per the CCH publication, and the accompanying regulations and annotated case law, which is published in the CCH Standard Federal Tax Reporter, is over 70,000 pages long. To give you an idea of how long that is, all 5 of George R.R. Martin's books in the Song of Ice and Fire series, Game of Thrones, have a combined total page count of roughly 4,244 pages as per Wikipedia. So yeah, 70,000 pages is a long read. 501c3, though, at least on the surface, is surprisingly straightforward. Let's read it together. 26 U.S.C. Section 501c3. The following organizations are referred to in subsection A. Oops. Let's go back. What does subsection A say? Well, it says exemption from taxation. Okay, so now we know that the following organizations are exempt from taxation. Why doesn't it just say that in the actual rule we are reading, I can hear you ask? Well, welcome to American tax law, the worst body of law mankind has ever drafted. In any case, the following organizations are exempt from taxation. Paragraph 3. Corporations and any community trust, fund, or foundation organized and operated exclusively for religious, charitable, scientific testing for public safety, literary, or educational purposes, or to foster national or international sports competition. Oh, we'll skip ahead a little bit. No part of the net earnings of which inures to the benefit of any private shareholder or individual, no substantial part of the activities of which is carrying on propaganda or otherwise attempting to influence legislation, except provided in subsection H, which totally allows 501c3s to influence legislation through lobbying, but that's outside of the scope of this video, and which does not participate in or intervene in any political campaign on behalf of any candidate for public office. Let me translate that for you and pull out only the relevant portion to extract our working definition. Organizations that are operated exclusively for charitable purposes, like fundraising for dementia research, no part of the net earnings of which benefit any private shareholder or individual are exempt from taxation. Wow, that sounds like a really simple definition. Yes, well, this is the code part of the definition, part of the 5,000 pages. The actual rules for operating a 501c3 are buried in the 70,000 pages of surrounding regulations and case law. All 501c3s, for example, as per IRC Section 508B, are classified as either public charities or private foundations, with some exceptions. And now, to be classified as a public charity, the entity must be something like a church or a school, but it can also be an organization that receives a substantial part of its contributions from the general public, or an organization that supports other public charities. A 501c3 is presumed to be a private foundation unless it specifically requests to be a public charity, at which point the IRS determines whether or not the organization has met the above criteria. Generally speaking, it's preferable to be a public charity over a private foundation if the objective is using public funds to support other organizations. Private foundations are subject to many different operating restrictions that public charities aren't. The reasoning behind this being that public charities are more open to public scrutiny, whereas private foundations are not. The IRS defines a public charity as a 501c3 that receives a greater portion of its financial support from the general public or government, and has greater interaction with the public. A private foundation is defined as being typically controlled by members of a family or by a small group of individuals, and derives much of its support from a small number of sources and from investment income. The takeaway here being, all 501c3s are charitable organizations, but not all charitable organizations are equal. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for example, is a private foundation. It's funded largely by the assets of a single family, and it can use those funds within the scope of what a 501c3 can do, without being as accountable to the public. As a private foundation, it files a 990-PF tax return. The Susan G. Komen Breast Cancer Foundation, on the other hand, is a public charity. It files Form 990. As per ProPublica's nonprofit Explorer, Susan G. Komen, a public charity, makes 90% of its revenue from contributions, and over a third of its expenses go to executive compensation and salaries. And the Gates Foundation, a private foundation, spends over 100% of its annual revenue on charitable disbursements. I've picked these two organizations to illustrate a very specific point. The tax law is extremely concerned about, number one, what your goals are as a charity, and number two, where your funds come from, but it is less concerned about how you meet your goals. Susan G. Komen is a public charity. Most of its funds come from contributions, but a large part of those contributions are spent paying their employees, and not being spent on, say, distributions to research organizations. That's not illegal in the slightest. It's not the government's job to tell Susan G. Komen how to do its job of raising awareness for breast cancer and/or funding breast cancer research. On the surface, Susan G. Komen seems like it's spending a lot of contributed money only to disperse very little of it for the purpose of research, but the good a charity does is not solely in the money it distributes. If Susan G. Komen raises awareness and generates funds that would otherwise not have existed, it is arguably a net positive, and the degree to which it is a positive is hard to quantify. The state doesn't concern itself, for the most part, with the quantifying unless something fraudulent is happening, in which case we move outside of the purview of tax law and into the purview of criminal law. Jesus Christ, Mooney, how much more of this law stuff are we going to do? Look, I promise we're almost done. The rabbit hole is extremely deep here, 70,000 pages deep to be exact, so bear with me. We've almost put together the bare minimum we need to tackle this subject with any degree of nuance. Just be glad that I moved the crim law stuff to the analysis section. In any case, a private foundation has more room to operate than a public charity, provided it follows some additional regulations, like the filing of a 990-PF. The additional regulations that a private foundation has to follow are determined in part by what category of private foundation they are. For tax purposes, there are 3 types of foundations. Number 1, a private operating foundation. Number 2, an exempt operating foundation. And number 3, a private non-operating foundation. But we won't get into the differences as it's outside of the scope of the video. Just know that the rules can change depending on the kind of foundation you operate. Private foundations, as we know, have to file an annual Form 990-PF, but private foundations are also required to follow rules concerning prohibited transactions or risk being subject to an excise tax, which is like a tax penalty of sorts. If further violations occur, additional taxes or penalties might be levied. The prohibited transactions are as follows. A private foundation must not, number 1, engage in self-dealing, number 2, fail to distribute income for charitable purposes, number 3, have excess business holdings, number 4, make any jeopardizing investments, and number 5, make any taxable expenditures. Of these 5 prohibited transactions, 2 are relevant to our case, self-dealing and failure to distribute income. I know what you're thinking, and no. Having excess business holdings does not mean having tons of cash lying around. It means specifically that the foundation can't own more than 20% of the voting stock of a different corporation. In any case, self-dealing occurs when a private foundation conducts a transaction like providing goods or services or paying compensation to a disqualified person. Who counts as a disqualified person? Well, the answer is all substantial contributors to the foundation, all managers of the foundation, an owner of more than 20% of the foundation in a few circumstances, and a member of the family of any of the individuals described in 1, 2, or 3. In short, the foundation can't offer a good or service or pay certain people, including the owner of the foundation, the managers of the foundation, and their family members, without being subject to additional taxation. As for failing to distribute income for charitable purposes, a private foundation other than an operating foundation is required to annually distribute 5% of the foundation's net investment assets, and a failure to do so will subject the foundation to an excise tax of 30% of any undistributed income. Meaning, if Open Hand is a private foundation, it has to make at least 5% distributions pursuant to its income or risk being levied a heavy excise tax. But here's the thing. A public charity does not have this prohibited transaction requirement. Public charities generally have a lot more leeway than private foundations do. All 501c3s are presumed to be private foundations unless they affirmatively file to be categorized as a public charity. And for the record, most 501c3s do exactly that right out of the gate. But a private foundation that has later filed to become a public charity and has that petition granted by the IRS might legally have to masquerade for a time as a private foundation whilst still being categorized as a public charity. Although public charities are less restricted in what they can do compared to private foundations, they are still subject to the overarching rule of 501c3s from earlier, which is that no part of the net earnings of the public charity may inure to the benefit of any private individual or shareholder, which is defined as a person having a personal and private interest in the activities of the organization. Which is to say, a public charity can't be organized for the financial benefit of yourself or your family, and no part of the net earnings may inure or take effect to the benefit of yourself or your family. Inurement is a very wide net. An improper use of assets, for example, might warrant a penalty. A more serious inurement like embezzlement might invite criminal liability. But because the tax code is such a mess and so confusing, the IRS can be pretty forgiving when it comes to mere clerical errors, which is to say, poorly filed paperwork. You'll notice once again, just as before when we talked about the Gates Foundation and Susan G. Komen, that the law cares very much about the goals of a charitable organization, which is to say what it operates for. And the law cares very much about the people running the charitable organization and how much money they're taking away from the charity's income. But especially for a public charity, how the organization goes about the act of fulfilling its goals are left more or less to the organization, with some exceptions, like when the act of fulfilling its goals crosses the line to taking away from the charity's income in the form of inurement. So that was a lot, and honestly a lot of it was paraphrased, and we've only just scratched the surface. American tax law is the single most convoluted body of law in the world, and I'm not a tax lawyer. But I think we've put together just enough context to understand what is going on. Now that you know what a 501c3 is, what the difference between public charities and private foundations are, and what the law expects of private foundations and public charities, we can finally look at the Open Hand Foundation and the allegations made by Karl Jobst and some ordinary gamers to see if anything unethical or illegal has occurred, as the law sees it. Congratulations, you survived the tax law portion of the video. If you thought to yourself, wow, that was long and tedious, don't blame me, blame Lex Torius. In any case, let's finally get to the allegations. I've gone through a few of Karl Jobst's videos on the topic, including the most recent response video, and put together a list of allegations. I've augmented that list with additional allegations made by Mudahar over at Some Ordinary Gamers. We'll go over each allegation, weigh it against the Completionist's apology video, and then determine whether the allegation is plausible, implausible, inconsequential, or trouble. What does trouble mean? Well, trouble is the kind of thing that I'd hypothetically advise a client to avoid saying if they don't want to be sued. Maybe by seeing where the invisible lines lie, you yourself might be able to avoid trouble when you make such similar statements. Starting with Jobst's claims in his very first video. He alleges the following. The Open Hand Foundation has not contributed a single cent to any organization. They've raised $600,000 and it's sitting in their bank account. Jobst says this is important because if a charity raises money, they are supposed to give it to an organization. He then points to the publicly available 990PF, which shows that the contributions have indeed been piling up and that no distributions have been made, despite Gerard's public claims that he has been working with a variety of charitable organizations. As an aside, Jobst also points out that the 990PF hasn't been signed. As such, Jobst accuses Gerard and the Open Hand Foundation of, number 1, charity fraud, number 2, of lying about working with charities when no funds were distributed, and number 3, of unethical and almost certainly illegal behavior.
That being said, even if all of the money is still there, the actions of Open Hand were unethical and almost certainly illegal.
Let's call these allegations the original 3. Jobst then adds to the allegations, stating that the funds from a fundraiser golf tournament run by the Completionist's father, known as the Convenience Cup Challenge, which should be going to the Open Hand Foundation, are not accurately reflected in the foundation's tax returns. Jobst calls this misrepresentation, and Mudahar specifically points out that this could be embezzlement. A surprise allegation is then made concerning Jamie Lee Curtis, who reported the Open Hand Foundation on her organization's tax returns as a public charity and not a private foundation. So far, we have been operating under the assumption that the Open Hand Foundation is a private foundation because it files a 990PF. The allegation here is that the money that Jamie Lee Curtis is contributing is being wrongly reported for one, and second, is not being accurately accounted for in Open Hand's tax returns. To summarize, the first allegation here is that the income from the Convenience Cup Challenge is not being reported on the tax returns, which could be misrepresentation or embezzlement. The second allegation is that the Convenience Cup Challenge itself might be conducting some kind of fraudulent activity, as it appears to be generating massive income for the Open Hand Foundation, which is not stated on the tax returns. And the third allegation is that Jamie Lee Curtis's organization is mistakenly identifying the Open Hand Foundation as a public charity, and that the money being contributed has not been reported on Open Hand Foundation's tax returns. We'll categorize these allegations as missing funds. Now, instead of going chronologically to the Completionist's apology, we're going to skip ahead and see what the final list of Jobst's allegations looks like. In the response video's intro, Jobst outlines his final 3 allegations. Number 1, the Completionist committed charity fraud. As that flashes on screen, Jobst states that the Completionist committed charity fraud by making false, misleading statements about what the charity was doing in order to solicit donations. Allegation number 2 is that the Completionist stole money. Jobst says that the Completionist stole donations that were supposed to go to the Open Hand Foundation. Allegation number 3 is that the golf charity money is missing. Here, Jobst says that the revenue generated by the golf tournament run by Gerard's family was not being sent to the Open Hand Foundation. If we combine then this final list with the allegations made in prior videos, the fundamental allegations are, number 1, the Completionist committed charity fraud by lying about what donations received by Open Hand were being used for. Number 2, the Completionist stole some of the money Open Hand should have received, which is embezzlement. And number 3, there are funds that are still missing, presumed stolen, from the golf tournament, from Jamie Lee Curtis, and more, as per the Open Hand Foundation's tax returns. Now that we have our allegations, let's see what the defendant has to say. How does Gerard defend against these claims. Well, Gerard's apology is very interesting, to say the least. It's immediately apparent that lawyers were involved in this statement, and I gotta say, it's well put together. Jobst calls this apology the worst video he's ever seen. But he wouldn't say that if he was a lawyer and could read between the lines here. Consider the opening statement, asserting charity fraud, and more. It's a hit right at a weak spot in Jobst's argument, and it baits a very specific response, one which Jobst fell for hook, line, and sinker. But that's a topic for a future Law Review episode, I suspect. You can also consider the very precise language being used here in the formatting of the video, which looks a lot like how I format my videos, because all lawyers are taught to draft this way: issue, rule/context, argument, and conclusion. It looks like his attorneys also categorized the allegations similarly. The explanation proper begins with the completionist talking about donating his mother's body to research. It's meaningful, it's easy to sympathize with, but it has a secondary motive. The completionist, the individual, is telling you that he has contributed something of value to unnamed organizations. He then states that he considers his family's legacy efforts as part of the Foundation's history. This statement, though an emotional appeal on its surface, also has potentially legal ramifications, as a way of demonstrating the Open Hand Foundation and the completionists directly working with certain unstated research organizations. Moving on, he states that the Open Hand Foundation started in 2014 as a private foundation. He then states that the Open Hand Foundation terminated its private foundation status and began operating as a public charity in 2016, with evidence showing that the conversion was, in fact, successful. He also confirmed that the foundation was still required to file Form 990-PF until the 60-month termination period concluded. He finishes this revelation by stating that
any possible issues pertaining to such filings can only be considered clerical errors and are in no way intended to be misleading, fraudulent, or criminal in any nature.
Remember what we said earlier about clerical errors in the IRS. Pay close attention to this word, intended. We'll see how that comes up later. Gerard then brings up Jobst's claim that the organization didn't sign its tax return before going into the subject of restricted and unrestricted donations. I don't think that this part of the video was very clear, so let me help clarify what he's talking about. Unrestricted donations are, as the name suggests, no strings attached donations. Spend it on whatever you like, including administrative costs or miscellaneous expenses. There's little to no accountability for the money once it gets donated. Moonchannel's donations to Doctors Without Borders, for example, are all unrestricted donations. Restricted donations, though, are dedicated to a purpose. For example, if you make a restricted donation of, I don't know, $600,000 to a charity, and the donation is restricted only to research activities, the charity cannot then pull that money and spend it on employee salaries. Here's the catch, though. When Gerard states that the bigger the donation is, the better, this is true. One might imagine that donating funds is just a matter of sending money, but that's not true. If you are donating permanently restricted funds, what you can do instead of just sending the money in one lump sum is you can set up an endowment fund, where the principal amount of money is either untouchable or is not wholly expendable, but the interest from the fund is usable. In this way, if you have a very large sum of principal delivered in the form of permanently restricted funds, you could potentially fund a charity in perpetuity. In other words, you know the old parable, give a man a fish and he's fed for a day, but teach a man to fish and he's fed for life? That's what's going on here. With a large enough endowment, the charity has money, not just for life, but forever. However, this requires not only a large sum, but a complicated procedure to set up the endowment, one that requires lawyers, which requires time and money. In addition, one has to carefully vet candidates and then determine what to restrict funds for in order to maximize the fund's effects. Because such an endowment is powered by interest, naturally the larger the fund is, the larger the principal and the more effective it is in the long run. It is typical behavior, it is even, dare I say, expected behavior for a public charity which has the intention of distributing its funds in a restricted manner to hold onto the money until the fund is substantially enough to make a long-term difference, as long as an endowment is on the table. It doesn't even have to be the plan from the outset. But if an endowment is a consideration, holding onto the funds is not unusual. Moving on, here comes the first mention of the golf tournament. Revenue sources for the foundation include direct and indirect public support, the golf fundraiser revenue, and Indieland revenue. The foundation's expenses include costs for the golf fundraiser and Indieland, operational costs, and various fees, totaling $178,951.17 over the last 9 years. Oh boy, numbers. Now let's see where this goes. Gerard lets us know that in 2023, the Tiltify campaign for Indieland raised approximately $64,315.90, which turned into about $61,200. $15,000 in sponsorships is then added, which gives us a final number of around $76,333, not including merchandise, bits, or subs. Gerard then states that there were costs from this event which come out to just under $12,000. Concerning Jobst's free tax auditing with regards to the golf tournament, Gerard acknowledges that they made a mistake in accounting. The money is all there, it's just bad math. He then describes how the golf tournament made less money moving forward due to COVID, and that the funds from the golf tournament didn't come in all at once, which caused some of the proceeds to roll over into the next year. And, he says, golf tournaments also have expenses. Gerard doesn't go into the specifics of this accusation with regards to, say, sponsored income from the golf tournament. On to the claims of embezzlement. Gerard defends these expenses by noting that the transition from private to public charity has expenses, and that the organization is legally allowed to use its proceeds to pay those expenses. And yeah, that's true. Lawyers can be expensive, as we all know. Gerard then discusses an allegation that I didn't bring up earlier, made by Mudahar, concerning the 5% payout rule for private foundations. Gerard defends against this allegation by stating that the foundation is a public charity and has been since 2016. Gerard concludes by stating that not a dollar raised from Indieland was ever used on anything to personally benefit me or my family. This language is not meant to suggest that Gerard didn't benefit from the clout of running Indieland or anything like that. It's meant to defend against claims of inurement, which we've discussed a little bit, but we'll go into further detail in the analysis portion of this video. The video closes with Gerard chastising Jobst and Mudahar before stating that he will not be painted as someone who is a con artist, that he will stand up to this situation, which is a not-so-subtle legal threat. Okay, so we finally have all of our allegations in a row, and we've reviewed the Completionist's response. It's time to break down each allegation and weigh each one against the facts and the law. Let me preface this section by stating that prior to this drama, I had never watched a Completionist or Jobst or Mudahar video, and that I don't have a horse in this race. What Jobst, Mudahar, and Gerard get up to is generally not my concern, but I do care a lot about charity work, which is why I want to weigh in. Outside of that, I maintain that I have no biases here. We'll start by reviewing our simplified allegations one last time. Number 1. The Completionist committed charity fraud by lying about what donations received by Open Hand were being used for. Number 2. The Completionist stole some of the money Open Hand should have received, which is embezzlement. And number 3. There are funds that are missing, presumed stolen from the golf tournament from Jamie Lee Curtis and more, as per the Open Hand Foundation's tax returns. Starting now, finally, with allegation number 1. Let's analyze the claims and see whether this allegation is plausible, implausible, inconsequential, or trouble. We'll start by asking a simple question. If you are going to make a legal allegation pursuant to a legal term with legal consequences, where should you get your definitions from? Well, I'll tell you where you shouldn't get your definitions from. Jobst and Mudahar both pull their definition of charity fraud, which is their primary and most severe allegation, from legalmatch.com, which is basically the lawyer's version of Christian Mingle. It helps prospective clients find lawyers. It's not a reliable legal resource. Jobst uses this definition. Charity fraud is when someone takes advantage of a charitable or non-profit organization for their own personal gain. But you see, this is not a legal definition. Open Hand is based in California. This is a legal definition. Any person who solicits or attempts to solicit or receives money or property of any kind for a charitable, religious, or eleemosynary purpose, and who directly or indirectly makes, utters, or delivers, either orally or in writing, an unqualified statement of fact concerning the purpose or organization for which the money or property is solicited or received, or concerning the cost and expense of solicitation or the manner in which the money or property or any part thereof is to be used, which statement is in fact false and was made, uttered, or delivered by that person either willfully and with knowledge of its falsity or negligently without due consideration of those facts, which by the use of ordinary care he or she should have known is guilty of a misdemeanor, and is punishable by imprisonment in the county jail for not more than 1 year, by a fine not exceeding $5,000, or by both that imprisonment and fine. What's the difference here between definition 1 and definition 2 aside from the length and clarity? Well, definition 1, being a simplification, is unclear about what the terms takes advantage and personal gain mean, and definition 1 uses organization language when definition 2 uses purpose language. Alright, I can see your head spinning, so let me translate definition 2 into plain English while attempting to preserve its meaning. If you take money for charity reasons and you say something about what that charity is or does, how much it costs to reach out to get that money, or how that money is going to be used, and you can't back up what you said with facts, then you're guilty of a misdemeanor, as long as you know what you said is untrue or you acted irresponsibly, when you really should have known the things you said were untrue. But Mooney, I can hear you say, that definition was exactly the same as the first one, right? This is just semantics. Well, if you think the distinctions are semantic, then respectfully, you aren't qualified to be calling this behavior certainly illegal. If charity fraud is merely taking advantage of a charitable organization for personal gain, then if Jobst is wrong in his accusations, he's committed charity fraud. Does that sound right to you? Let's take a look at what Gerard said together with regards to what OpenHand has done and where the money is going. He states that OpenHand has partnered with or worked with organizations including the USF and the Alzheimer's Association. He states that
we're trying to help those who are affected by Alzheimer's, all types of dementia, and beyond. Specifically, families who have just found out that a loved one has dementia, and the next steps that are taken to help them transition from the shock of it all to the next steps of getting in-house care and so much more.
And he states that IndieLand's proceeds go towards charity. But we know from the tax returns that OpenHand's accumulated funds were not in fact being used anywhere at the time these statements were made. That said, these statements are not conclusive, direct evidence of wrongdoing. This is circumstantial evidence, and we can interpret these statements either charitably or uncharitably. Interpreted charitably, we see how Gerard's apology video comes into play. How if one considers the initial donation of his mother's body to science, and the interactions between his family and unnamed organizations, that there is some lineage of working together with whatever those organizations happened to be. Furthermore, of course, working with or even partnering with an organization doesn't necessarily imply funding it. Susan G. Komen is a public charity for breast cancer awareness, but their actual contributions to breast cancer research are somewhat limited. And that's okay. That's not only legal, but arguably, depending on one's perspectives, also ethical. It could be the case that OpenHand is working with USF or the Alzheimer's Association in ways that aren't necessarily reflected on the tax returns. And the times where Gerard has stated that funding has occurred might be obvious miscommunications, or simple misstatements, human error that no reasonable person would take seriously. Of course, OpenHand isn't a primary funder of the University of San Francisco. Any reasonable person would see that this was a misstatement made by a very clearly nervous individual trying to do public speaking. If one interprets these statements uncharitably, though, then it looks like Gerard is obfuscating the truth of the matter, which is that the money going into OpenHand isn't being spent on what he says it is. This uncharitable position is the one Jobst takes from the get-go. If we take this uncharitable approach and then apply the facts to our legal definition, if Gerard did actually know that OpenHand was holding on to all of the money, or he should have known that this was the case, but he continued to say that he's worked with all of these charities and has donated money to help families, he is guilty of a misdemeanor. Here's the thing though, legal justice, unlike YouTube drama, has some rules of engagement, and a fundamental rule of justice is that people are innocent until proven guilty, and so I'm inclined to consider Gerard's statements charitably. Yet even if Gerard's statements are weighed charitably, even if one says, okay, I believe Open Hand has worked with the organizations it says it has and has contributed something, if not funds, to parents who are trying to figure out dementia, etc., then one could still make the argument that Gerard should have known that his statements may have been misleading. This is especially the case for the most recent Indieland event, at which time I believe Jobst had already conducted the interview with Gerard and made his intentions known. If Gerard was negligent in his statements under California law, that is still potentially charity fraud. Oh boy, okay, quick crash course. Negligent is also a legal term of art. It is one of the 4 states of mind that we collectively call mens rea. If you do something wrong, you either do it intentionally, knowledgeably, recklessly, or negligently. Let's say royalty-free Smug Dolphin here is standing on a ladder. If you went out of your way to kick the ladder down in order to harm the dolphin, you acted with intent or purpose. If you set up the ladder in such a way that you knew collapse was inevitable but didn't care, and the ladder collapses with the dolphin on it, you acted with knowledge. If you set up the ladder only halfway, leave, and then it collapses on the dolphin as it swims by, you might have acted recklessly. And if you set up the ladder in the middle of the street without warning signs and the dolphin bumps into it, causing the ladder to fall on the dolphin, you may have acted negligently. Gerard, even if the statements he made are considered charitably, has arguably uttered a false statement about Open Hand negligently, without due consideration of the facts which by use of ordinary care he should have known. This potential argument of negligence is corroborated by Gerard's statement that he didn't know that Open Hand had never donated the money. It could be argued that Gerard, as the primary fundraiser for Open Hand and as an officer of that organization, should have known that Open Hand hadn't made any monetary distributions and thus acted negligently when making his statements implying that it had. Now, there is a lot of presumptions here, individual points of contention that could go either way and aren't nearly as open and shut as Jobst makes them out to be. That said, given what I've seen of Gerard's statements and of the law itself, I'm inclined to call this initial allegation of charity fraud plausible. But let me qualify that with a caveat. Though charity fraud is plausible here, plausible does not mean likely, and I am of the opinion that it is unlikely that any actual charity fraud has occurred. Why do I believe that? Well, just as the intentions of actions can change how culpable one is of a crime, the intentions of legislature can change the plain functions of a law. And it appears to me that the intention of 532D's wording is to target people like charity scamming phone solicitors, who aren't in the same box as Gerard, if Gerard's words are weighed charitably. This is as far as I can go, however, in interpreting California law, as I am not a California lawyer. I know my limits, and despite agreeing that Jobst's allegation of charity fraud is plausible here, I still have strong feelings about his sloppy research. As such, I'm going to further distinguish this finding of plausible by stating that Jobst's initial statement in his first video that Gerard's behavior was almost certainly illegal is trouble. This is not how justice works. You don't find the label to fit the deed and then gather evidence after the fact. You can't start with, it's definitely charity fraud, and then go hunting for evidence, because if you go hunting for witches, you will inevitably find them. The initial evidence presented in Jobst's first video is not nearly enough for him to draw a conclusion of illegal behavior with certainty, and it does come across a bit like a witch hunt and not a proper investigation. And this brings us to allegation number 2, that the completionist stole money. You'll note that our definition of charity fraud doesn't necessarily implicate any taking of money from the charity to use for one's self. And so it is very important for us to distinguish the difference between charity fraud and embezzlement. The allegation that Gerard lied about what Open Hand is doing and has done is charity fraud, and even if Gerard is charged with charity fraud, it is ultimately a simple misdemeanor. It's like shoplifting. The allegation that Gerard stole money from Open Hand is potentially far more serious. If the value of the stolen funds exceeds $950, which it would, then this charge of embezzlement is no mere misdemeanor. It is a felony under California law, with a fine up to $10,000 and a term of up to 3 years in state prison. Jobst states in his final response that he doesn't even know how embezzlement got brought into the allegations, which worries me, as he's been alleging embezzlement the whole time. Mudahar even used the term embezzlement in one of his early videos on the topic, potentially even the first video if I recall correctly. And so it is no mystery how or why Girard's response discusses embezzlement. The sloppiness of the legal research really comes through here when we discuss Jobst's arguments surrounding embezzlement. In Jobst's final video, he pulls this definition of embezzlement from Google. How do I know that? Well, I typed definition of embezzlement into Google and this automatic generation popped up right at the top. Now look, for a non-legal definition this is fine, but this is a legal accusation and this is not a legal definition, and there is a very big difference. This Oxford Languages definition has no context. A legal definition is greater than the sum of its words. What also matters is how courts have treated the language. Jobst's definition of embezzlement is theft or misappropriation of funds placed in one's trust or belonging to one's employer. California's definition is CPC Section 503. Embezzlement is the fraudulent appropriation of property by a person to whom it has been entrusted. See the spelling of entrusted there with the I? It's written like that because the law was enacted in 1872, and as such, it has a century and a half of precedents built on top of it, which affects its definition. The best way we have of approximating the actual definition of embezzlement is better summed up through the Judicial Council of California criminal jury instructions, which states that to prove a defendant is guilty of embezzlement, one must prove that: number 1, an owner entrusted his or her property to the defendant. Number 2, the owner did so because he or she trusted the defendant. Number 3, the defendant fraudulently converted that property for his or her own benefit. And number 4, when the defendant used the property, he or she intended to deprive the owner of its use. Remember our discussion of mens rea earlier? Well, this definition is fundamentally different from Jobst's definition because it adds the qualifier of intention to the calculus. So here's what we have to prove to show that embezzlement occurred. We can all acknowledge that donors gave money to Girard/Openhand and that donors trusted Girard/Openhand with that money. However, we must also show that Girard fraudulently converted the donated funds for his own benefit, and that when he used that property, he intended to deprive the donors of its use. Can we prove any of that? Well, let's find out. Jobst argues that Girard is admitting to embezzlement when Girard says that the money donated during Indieland is going to charity, and that he, meaning Girard, wasn't touching any of it. Girard says this very frequently, when in fact, according to Jobst, the money is not going to charity as it is just sitting there, and some of that money is being used on expenses, when Girard suggests that he has had to personally cover expenses for Indieland in the past. So, since Girard says all money goes to charity, that he hasn't touched any of the donations, and that Indieland expenses have at times been covered out of pocket, when the tax returns show that Openhand has spent money on expenses, Girard is lying, and thus his actions constitute, and I quote, admitting to embezzlement. Or, as stated elsewhere in Jobst's final video, that this is textbook charity fraud and is the literal definition of embezzlement.
This is again textbook charity fraud and is the literal definition of embezzlement.
Except, no it isn't. Your definition of charity fraud isn't from a textbook, it's from attorney-client Tinder. And your literal definition of embezzlement is literally not the right definition of embezzlement. The tax returns seem to show that no money has been taken out of the donated sum of $600,000. None of the charity's officers appear to have received any payment from this principal. The numbers might be inaccurate due to clerical error, but that alone is mere negligence at worst. It's not intentional. And even if it was intentional, there is no convincing evidence whatsoever that Girard has converted the donated money for his own personal use. We'll get in a little bit to the claims that the funds are being hidden from the tax returns. If we look just at Girard's statements, this time weighed uncharitably, believing all his statements are deliberate falsehoods engineered to attract donations, then at worst we end up with charity fraud, but not embezzlement. We are still missing an intention to convert the money for personal gain, not just an implication, not just an act of negligence, but actual intention is necessary. If we look at Girard's statements charitably, however, which we really should because we believe that people are innocent until proven guilty, then really there's nothing legally wrong here. Girard says that all the money goes to charity. He's not wrong. Openhand is a public charity, remember that. He says that he doesn't touch any of it. That is true if weighed charitably. He receives no apparent payout, even if the charity disperses some of its donated income to use for expenses. And remember our 501c3 regulations, no part of the net earnings of which inures to the benefit of any private shareholder or individual. It is expected for a charity to use donated funds to pay for expenses. That is part of what charities do, and those expenses do not appear to be disbursements to any of Open Hand Foundation's officers. It could even be the case that Gerard has in fact donated his personal income to Open Hand to use on Indie Land expenses. We don't know if that is the case, and neither does Jobst, which means that none of us are in a position to make allegations as serious as embezzlement. Jobst also brings up the Open Hand Foundation's recent donation of the accumulated $600,000 to the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration, stating that the holding of the funds for the purpose of making a restricted donation makes no sense if now, all of a sudden, the foundation can in fact make such a donation, thus suggesting again some kind of malfeasance. But as we discussed earlier, it's perfectly normal for a public charity to hold onto funds, especially if a complicated endowment might be on the table. Let me ask all of you, why do you suspect the Open Hand Foundation suddenly had to donate $600,000 instead of waiting to build a substantial potential endowment fund? What could have possibly forced their hand? I can venture a guess. An uneducated allegation of serious criminal conduct pursuant to research that is no deeper on the legal side than the first page of Google. This allegation of embezzlement is both trouble and implausible. If a defamation lawsuit does arise from this debacle, I suspect that this allegation of embezzlement will take front and center stage. Okay, but what about allegation number 3, the missing funds? Don't these also play into allegation number 2, which is potential embezzlement? Why, if there is any embezzlement going on, it must be here, right? What about the golf tournament or Jamie Lee Curtis or the Twitch bits and stuff? All of that money isn't adding up, right? Look at the numbers. There's all this cash missing that should be included in the tax returns. If it isn't there, it must be somewhere, and the somewhere it is with Gerard and his family in their pockets. Now let me ask you this, American taxpayers. If you mess up and underreport on your taxes, what happens to you? You pay the difference and a penalty, and that's a fairly normal occurrence because American tax law is a 70,000-page bureaucratic hellscape. Bad tax reporting isn't even remotely enough proof to show embezzlement. Now, do I agree that the golf tournament in particular is a little bit suspicious? Yes, it is a little suspicious. I could even believe that some cash has been unlawfully skimmed off the top of that event. But the evidence provided, the numbers, the showing of the sponsors, none of that is adequate evidence because we don't know what anyone actually paid or when they paid it. And what we don't know, we can't just assume. Gerard says that there was some inaccuracy in the tax reporting, and I'm inclined to believe him because that's very common, and doubly so for organizations like 501c3s. And remember, right? Innocent until proven guilty. Benefit of the doubt goes to the accused. Gerard could probably resolve this numbers game by submitting to something like a third-party audit and showing the results. But even that's not necessary, as the IRS is absolutely going to audit Open Hand after this debacle, and we will all have a chance to see for ourselves what the final numbers look like, and if there really is any malfeasance occurring. However, even in consideration of all of the above, there is another aspect about all of this tax return analysis that must be pointed out. Why did Gerard specifically bring up Jobst and Mutahar's mistake concerning the absence of a signature on the tax returns? Jobst makes a big deal about this and presents it as if it is just some kind of a gotcha statement. But it wasn't meant to be a gotcha. It's meant to show a very fundamental truth about these accusations. Jobst and Mutahar have a less than zero level of requisite legal understanding, a degree of legal knowledge so unqualified that the accusers don't even know about e-filing signatures on tax returns. We have here an Australian and a Canadian who aren't able to recognize even the most fundamental aspect of American tax returns performing a tax audit on a 501c3 charitable organization pursuant to circumstantial evidence, hearsay, and legal research limited to Googling charity fraud and embezzlement and copy-pasting the first thing that popped up. I wonder if this is what H-Bomber Guy feels like. But I digress. The point is, we don't have enough information to conclude that funds are missing, and certainly not enough information to conclude that any missing funds here have been stolen and embezzled. The circumstantial evidence does seem to suggest that missing funds are possible, but it's not at all certain. As such, I am calling allegation number 3, the missing funds, plausible, but also likely inconsequential. There's a philosophical saying, a razor, that I rely upon in my practice as a lawyer, but also in my day-to-day life as a human being. A way of thinking that reduces conflict, minimizes drama, and is generally accurate. It's called Hanlon's razor, and it goes something like this. Never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. Ignorance is something we all occasionally fall victim to, the Jobsts, the Gerards, and the Moonies, for that matter, alike. And frankly, given what I've seen emerge from the completionist debacle, I'm inclined to give Gerard the benefit of the doubt. The court of public opinion is no place to try this case. Maybe I've missed something important, and if I have, please bring it to my attention in the comments. I'll try and address it there or gather enough questions for a follow-up mini-episode in response. Let me make something clear though before we wrap up this video. I might make content, but I'm not big into YouTube. Prior to this matter being brought to my attention, as I had stated before, I never watched a single video by Karl Jobst or the Completionist or some ordinary gamers. This script and its notes total over 16,000 words, around 32 single-spaced pages, because after watching the videos but before thinking in depth about their contents, I was initially quite convinced by Karl Jobst. Gerard isn't always the best communicator, and he has a tendency to speak before thinking, I've noticed. When Gerard is being interviewed by Jobst and he asks if Jobst wants money or something to put a stop to the investigation, is this Gerard offering a bribe? Or is this Gerard asking whether he's being extorted? It's hard to say, but it certainly looks ugly. I hate to see such serious accusations being levied, pursuant to such poor legal research. These accusations might be responsible for the termination of Indieland and the abandonment of a carefully organized endowment, which could cost the field of dementia research potentially millions of dollars in funding. There were a lot of numbers thrown around by Jobst and Mutahar, so let me provide some numbers of my own. Let me show you how the sausage is made. My most popular video to date has 900,000 views. It's made about $5,500. I can't disclose what I receive from sponsors due to contractual obligations, but what I can say is that in my experience, a sponsor pays around $20 to $30 per anticipated 1,000 views. And YouTubers like Jobst and Mutahar, who can frequently break that 1 million view barrier, will receive premium rates for their sponsorships. Jobst has produced 3 videos on the Completionist, 2 of which were sponsored. Mutahar has made 5 videos on this already, though he hasn't solicited sponsors to my knowledge for those videos. Let's add up the views on each video and average them out, and then lowball the figure. We'll say each video has made about $5,000. Let's lowball each sponsorship too, and say each one was worth not $20,000 or $30,000, but a mere $8,000. That's around $40,000 in YouTube income and $16,000 in sponsorships. Our lowball figure is about $56,000 made on the back of these accusations, roughly the annual median American male individual income. Let me ask you something, gentlemen. Let's say that OpenHand's tax returns, an inevitable tax audit next year, come back, and no charges of embezzlement or even fraud materialize. Or let's say that the state of California pursues an action against OpenHand and discovers at the end of it that they were innocent. I will be extra clear here because I know that there's a tendency to mince words and move goalposts. I don't mean mere punitive fines or even excise taxes. I mean specific governmental action and results against the OpenHand Foundation for the crimes of embezzlement and/or fraud that you have specifically alleged. Can we expect you to apologize and donate your earnings and the sponsorship income from the relevant videos to dementia research charities? You might not want to answer that right away. Maybe talk to your own lawyers before you agree to anything. They might not want you making any confessions prior to a potential defamation action. And if such a defamation suit is filed, we'll cover that too in a future law review episode. I am just a tiny fish in an enormous YouTube ocean, but I'm proud to report that Moon Channel, despite only being monetized in February of 2023, has donated $4,255 to and raised an additional $1,261 in YouTube fundraising for Doctors Without Borders in 2023. I know from experience that managing charitable contributions is burdensome and thankless, so I don't solicit funds. If the channel does a fundraiser, it goes through YouTube's systems straight to the charity. And I also donate 10% of Moon Channel's income to charity as well, with the money coming not from your pockets, but from my own. If you'd like to make a difference today, please consider checking out the fundraiser I've opened on this video supporting the Alzheimer's Association. I will be matching your donation out of pocket up to a maximum of $500, far more than this video is ever likely to make on YouTube. It's not much, but perhaps we can build something good from all of this trouble. I apologize as well for the lower quality of this video's editing. It's meant to be a law review episode and thus a shorter, quicker episode to make, but I got carried away with the script. You know how it is. I've been your host, Mooney, and thank you for tuning in to Moon Channel.
Carl! There is a dead human in our house!
Oh, hey! How did he get here?
Carl, what did you do?
Me? I didn't do this.
Explain what happened, Carl!
I've never seen him before in my life.
Why did you kill this person, Carl?
I do not kill people. That is my least favorite thing to do.
Tell me, Carl, exactly what you were doing before I got home.
All right, well, I was upstairs.
Okay.
I was sitting in my room.
Yes.
Reading a book.
Go on.
And, well, this guy walked in.
Okay.
So I went up to him.
Yes.
And I stabbed him 37 times in the chest.
Carl, that kills people!
Wow, I didn't know that.
How could you not know that?
Yeah, I'm in the wrong here. I suck.
What happened to his hands?
What's that?
His hands. Why are they missing?
Well, I kind of cooked them up and ate them.
Carl!
Well, I was hungry, and, well, you know, when you crave hands, that's...
Why on earth would you do that?
I was hungry for hands. Give me a break.
Carl!
My stomach was making the rumblies that
Carl!
only hands would satisfy.
What is wrong with you, Carl?
Well, I kill people and I eat hands. That's two things.